It's a hot topic. Now, a lot of companies are grappling with how to build their brand, how to engage culture.
Well, hey, good day. Welcome to the Consultant with the Coach podcast. Hey, first, Josh, how are you?
I'm hanging in there. Hey, good to see you.
Welcome back. We don't normally record on Fridays. We usually record Mondays when we're sharp. It's Friday afternoon, which is okay.
And you spent one night driving this week.
I did spend one night driving. I spent 20-some hours going from Arizona to Washington, and it was amazing. Okay, and I'm glad to be back.
We're glad you're back
Here.
Welcome
and it's
back.
Awesome. And today, it's one of those things. We were somewhat joking, but then we're like, why not? Let's do a podcast on DE&I. And I was like, well, Josh, what is that? And evidently, this is so when you work in a private business. Whereas Josh, as a consultant who has worked for all sorts of businesses and is up to date on everything, or it seems like everything.
Well, pretend where I don't know.
Yeah. DE&I, he just explained this to me, stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So obviously I am not the expert, but I'll just offer my tidbit, whereas you have been in all sorts of organizations. But first, before we get into that, what scripture verse do you have for us today?
Yeah, in support of DE&I, but we will take some different viewpoints on this today, so don't check out immediately if you love or don't love DE&I. But Galatians 3:28 says to us, to ground us a little bit today. Oh my goodness, it disappeared from me. Where did it go? I was just looking at it. And there it is. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. Do you want to read that again?
Oh, that was great.
Okay. All right. So I think there's certainly elements to diversity and equity and inclusion that are in the Bible. However, I think
what I liked about that is neither Jew nor Greek.
Right.
We're going back 2,000 years, and there was all sorts of division back then.
Yeah, theologically, God has made all people. Right. We have to recognize that there is Scripture indicates God's image in all people.
Absolutely.
Right? And Jesus repeatedly, basically cared for all people, male, female, Jew or not. Right. And so it was very inclusive in that way. However, we talked to a lot of companies about DE&I issues, and I think today we're going to unpack some of the pros, a lot of the cons that a lot of people might be afraid to talk about in what we see today, and how that could be a problem for companies and how they should be careful, tread carefully in DE&I, because it's, not, while it is the latest and greatest idea coming out of, let's just say, certain universities, it's maybe not the most helpful to business. So
I can see that. So tell me, why should we even talk about this?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's a hot topic right now. A lot of companies are grappling with how to, build their brand, how to engage culture, how to respond to clashes of culture, political clashes, understand how to exist in this very divided world, right? With employees who have very strong opinions about many different things. Social media that seems to be driving the polarization even more. Media hype that drives it even more. And so trying to figure out how to be successful does require some element of recognizing an element of diversity in your workforce. More importantly, as we've talked about, not losing sight of your customers, right?
Absolutely.
Who your customers are, where you provide value in the market. You must maintain your sights there. And more likely than not, you serve some diverse element of customer, whether that's different product lines, different businesses, certainly different people, right? Keeping that in mind as you think about how you work with each other inside the company and, more importantly, work with your customers outside the company. So that's what it comes down to.
I agree.
Many times, I think, as we start getting to DE&I, where I think a lot of companies fail is they over-index on these issues because they feel cultural pressure. They fail to quantify the value of what they're getting for these programs. They spend an inordinate amount of money on consultants for not quantifiably valuable.
So is this something
returns.
that companies need to look into, or should they not? Or
If your company's not already looking into it, you're 10 years behind.
Okay.
Right? So there's something that, if you're not looking into it, then there's certainly DE&I consultants who'd be happy to sell you services. Whether you should do it or not is a different question. But tell me more about, you're a small business. Talk to us more about, from your small business perspective, or even from a coaching perspective, how do you come across these issues of, DE&I, recognizing that you haven't implemented like a formal program like a lot of other bigger companies have already done?
Until 5 minutes ago, I could not tell you what DE&I is or was. So,
yeah.
Now, I would say that there are two sides. There is my role as CEO and business owner on one side, and then there's coach on the other side. And they're different. There is a fair amount of overlap.
Right.
And one of the things that, from our business perspective, that we never really tread into. We're in the home healthcare industry, and no one ever says, we're only going to serve this group over here or this group over here. It's just like everyone equally comes into our store that has a broken ankle or needs a wheelchair. So for me, thinking diversity, I'm like, we just want to take care of people. And so I haven't had a lot of pushback, or even people say, hey, we want this or this within our business. We have a really diverse work environment. I encourage people to talk, and I don't know if that's the right answer, or do I need to look into it, or what do we need to talk about?
Well, one of the things you've done really well, which I think a lot of businesses I've worked in struggle with, is you've grounded yourself in really clear business metrics. Mm-hmm. Right? You have really clear KPIs. You have rocks that you're working on. For those who don't know rocks, they're kind of large, big boulder initiatives.
Yeah, quarterly goals, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Essentially, right? And these are the big ones. And unfortunately, companies who do not ground themselves in business reality have to find other ways to make people feel like they belong to the workplace. Mm-hmm. Right? They get away from one of the big knocks, and I've been reading up on this. One of the big knocks on DE&I is it distracts from meritocracy.
Okay, explain that to me.
Yeah, it distracts from a culture where you're actually building around what you achieve versus just showing up and feeling like you belong.
Okay. Right.
And the reality is, when you have a culture of people who show up and just feel like they belong but don't actually have any standards that are held around achievement, the business fails. If you just held people around like, hey, do you feel good when you come here? Doesn't mean they're going to get their job done.
No.
Very likely they're not going to get their job done. They're going to feel good about the day, but you're going to lose money real quick, right? And the reality is, people will flock to companies who will pay them to do nothing. And effectively, the slippery slope on DE&I is you get more and more people who sort of slide into the corners and feel really good about being there, but do almost nothing for the business. Mm-hmm. And the companies that learn how to, they leverage DE&I for the benefits of the business, because the business is there to serve customers, to make revenue, and to do so at a much lower cost than they can actually deliver the services for.
Okay.
Right? That's called a profit.
Right. So you're saying for business, as I say this with all sarcasm, profit's important.
Yeah, profit's important. And so many times DE&I causes cultural problems for a business because it doesn't enhance your ability to deliver revenue or do so at a lower cost. Mm-hmm. If someone tries to sell you a DE&I initiative, what you need to try to say, you tell them, is you show me quantifiable ROI about how this will increase my revenue. And it won't. It will not. Now, there are aspects of it that can, right? There are certainly aspects, like you told a really good story. I think about how you have someone in your team who works with customers who's in a wheelchair.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Which is great. Well, you serve people in wheelchairs. And so there is an ability for that person, one of your teammates, to empathize with your customers. That's worth a ton. That is great. The fact that you can help that person have a job regardless of their mobility, and that also is a service to your customers. That's a win-win. Mm-hmm. That is a great DE&I initiative, right? Versus if you had that person come in a wheelchair, but they were required to, move 3 tons of concrete a day by hand.
Well, it's not going to work.
It's not going to work, right? There is no accommodation you can make that makes a business sense from that, right?
And correct me, maybe this is why we haven't struggled with a whole lot of DE&I stuff is because we're in the home healthcare industry, I have to know all the rules on the American with Disabilities Act.
Yep.
And so for us, I've never seen it as kind of a diversity thing, but just understanding, okay, someone with a disability, whatever it looks like, I understand what all the rules are, what can be asked, what cannot be asked of.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, it's like, how, so for example, let's take this team member of ours who has a disability, but at the same time, it was really quite easy to work around it.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things. I'm not going to put in an elevator in our building. Granted, we're single story, but I just use that because that's a $100,000 investment. Mm-hmm. We don't have the funds to do that. But
right.
For us, it was really simple to accommodate. The guy's knocking it out of the park.
Yeah. Whereas
other people would say, I don't know if we can do this or that. And you're right. It's really helpful for our customers.
Sure. Well, and I think that's where we've got to measure things against. I think the reality is if you're struggling with DE&I, look very carefully at the business metrics. I think in one of the other challenges, I'll throw this out, this is probably controversial, I told you I'd say this beforehand, but there are several aspects to DE&I, especially when it comes to issues such as sexual orientation, gender fluidity, that at least from a faith perspective, when we believe, for example, that God created man, and it's a physical manifestation, right? Or woman, physical manifestation. And there is this area that is DE&I represents, and that's not the only issue, where truth becomes variable, right? Mm-hmm. And truth becomes whatever is in the eye of the beholder, right? And that's one of the underlying dangers of DE&I is you begin to strip away real truth. And the reality is you cannot run a business without truth.
You're right.
You can't run business outside of reality. There is cash in, there is cash out. There are expenses in, there are expenses out. There is customers, there are employees, right? That is the stark truth. And so DE&I has an ability or a potential to lead down a path of conversation around accommodating whatever truth each employee wants to believe, right? And the problem is that does not deliver a business.
Yeah.
Maybe a great social program, maybe that's something the business wants to invest in from a foundation perspective, or if the owner of the company or owners want to give their money to a nonprofit who deals in that, great, like mission-oriented, do what they want, it's a free country. But don't do it inside the business, because when you build a culture of not telling the truth, you build a culture of a business that fails.
So what you're saying is businesses should really focus on their mission.
Yes.
That's the
focus on their customer. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Which is why they're in business,
right.
Whether you're building houses or in my case, home health care or whatever it is.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you focus on the customer, and you have to stay grounded in truth, right? There is this continual sort of push on culture of, where we find ourselves today is because we don't have any grounding in truth, right? And businesses that aren't grounded in business reality, business truth, will struggle and fail. And DEI is not the only cause of that. There's certainly plenty of issues around that. But
what I loved what you said was truth can't be a variable.
No.
It's like I deny gravity. Well,
good luck.
Every time we jump up,
yeah.
you fall back to the earth.
Yeah.
Now there are gray areas. I'm not going to say everything's black and white.
Right.
But for example, in businesses, I don't have a single employee that will come to work day in and day out if we don't pay them. You have to. Absolutely. And I don't know any bank that will just give me money and, you don't have to pay it back.
Because
you don't worry about that.
Hey, don't worry, we're profitable. Okay, here's money.
That is some hard truth.
Yeah. No, and there's hard truth. And I think there's plenty of programs. And I think, not to pick on HR professionals, but the reality is, in my expertise or in my experience, HR generally, the HR sort of benefits and program space struggles immensely with this concept, right? Most of the programs, most of the benefits are these very wishy-washy, undefinable benefits, truths, helpful things to most employees, right? It's where I actually, in companies that can stomach it, I'll recommend that they basically just write a check to every employee instead of giving out benefits. Right? I mean, don't try to do health benefits if you can avoid it. Just calculate what your budget is for benefits, cut all the programs, and write everybody a check. Because your employees will be a lot happier, and they go use those to buy whatever things they want. But that's
I wish it
were.
I wish it were as simple as that. We've tried that before, and it didn't work.
Well, it's not quite that simple, but it's where you want to start.
So, but let me show you the coaching perspective on DE&I from my perspective.
Yeah.
And when I'm coaching clients, one of the things that I've noticed is, let's say there even is a disagreement between me and someone else, or I've seen when people change their mind, just the psychology of changing their mind, people are more likely to grab onto a viewpoint if they come up with it themselves. So in my coaching, where I'm really trying to lead them is, Josh, what is it that you think? Or tell me more about that. Because with a good coach, you need to lead someone to where it's at. I can't just say, hey, the Seahawks are going to win the Super Bowl this year. You'd be like, well, they don't even have a quarterback. All we're doing is we're arguing back and forth. You need to, embrace what you're going to believe. And this is where, you see this, to bring it back to faith. Look at Jesus. He didn't just tell people, hey, it's this, this, this. He talked in parables. He told stories. And this is stuff that we can do as business leaders. We could, for the sake of, hey, well, what is your perspective? And even if part of it's wrong, we'll try to figure things out. Well, why is that?
Yeah.
And they might be 80% wrong, but they also might be 20% right, and we can kind of figure that out.
And that's where, I don't want to rain too much on the DE&I parade, right? I want to be fair to a lot of people I respect who work in that space, right? There is a lot of truth, and that's where we started, right? We started with the helpful aspects of diversity, who God made people to be, the fact that people are called to be included in things, right? And in fact, Jesus was very inclusive with the gospel, right?
Oh, absolutely.
And so I don't want to take it all away. There's certainly some helpful truths there to business leaders. I think what I just want to call people to caution and understand is if they're feeling frustrated by either the program they have or their lack of desire to have a program, there is some truth in there, but there's also a lot of not truth. So be careful how you engage.
Let's come back to truth. Yeah. I mean, you're saying some really good things, because I think that's some of the frustrations that I would, when I've heard other people, they'll say, well, it's not true. And then, but they don't continue to talk about, well, what happens if you don't have truth? And what happens if you don't have trust?
Yeah. Yeah, well, a culture erodes, right? If you, as the CEO, are depending on your team to diagnose and give you truth, and you can't trust them, either because what they're saying is intentionally untrue, or because they fail the capacity to diagnose and produce the truth, which is actually worse in some ways.
Really?
Then you can't make decisions. And if you can't make decisions, then the company's paralyzed. And all of a sudden you fall behind very quickly and you start losing money and you're out of business, right? That's the path, right? With a lack of the ability to tell truth in a company will quickly lead to problems. Now, I will say that back on that front, though, there is research that, for example, having a leadership team of a diverse set of individuals from experiences to age to race to gender, can produce a wider perspective, and that wider perspective can lead to better decisions, which is a business reality, right? And therefore, there's value in that. We do want
diversity.
Absolutely.
There, we don't want groupthink.
Yeah. No, so there's definitely, this is where you get positive aspects of DE&I for sure, and so. The encouragement I have for business leaders is just to continue to work your way through that, carefully and with grace, like we always talk about. You're going to make mistakes and end up one side or the other too much, right? More than you have to. I
had an argument with my wife a few weeks ago, and it was really but it ended up really well. We were arguing over one thing, but I was taking it apart, and I'm like, okay, it sounds like we're arguing over this one thing, but we were talking about it in a good, really healthy way, and we realized of this one thing we were disagreeing on, we were actually 95% on the same page together. And we're like, okay, this is pretty good. I mean, we're actually arguing over subpoint C.4.5.
Right.
That's totally okay. And we're like, you know what? Let's just give this some time. We're in 95% agreement over here. And I was a history minor in college. One thing I've learned about history is typically over the course of time, things do kind of settle out over time. So if it is something that, hey, you know what? We're going to disagree on this, but let's hit the pause button and come back to it. There's nothing wrong typically on certain issues with punting.
Yep.
Let's talk about it. And if anything, you might say, hey, Eric, what you were saying, that kind of resonates with me. Hey, Josh, I really liked that point you brought. And maybe not tomorrow, but 6 months from now, instead of being, maybe we're now 98% on the same page, that's the beauty of, shall I call it inclusion, or what you would call that?
Well, I think it's level-headedness, to be honest.
Okay.
I think one of the biggest challenges leaders face today too is we have a very reactionary culture. Mm-hmm. Very reactionary. Whipsaw, up, down, whatever. Unsustainably, mm-hmm. right? And so, how do we have a leadership personality, leadership culture that embraces people, gives them space, right, to work through what they're working through, without also following it in line with sort of the reactionary, we got to put in this DE&I program. We got to change this thing.
Mm-hmm.
We got to put out this statement on this issue that happened in culture today, right? Do you? I mean...
Or what if we don't? That's a good question.
What if we don't?
What if we don't do it?
And maybe there's reasons to do it, but I think there's such a... it's so easy to post something on social media. It's so easy to change my profile picture and think I'm making a statement about the war in Ukraine. I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, nobody cares what I post on my social media page about the war in Ukraine. I mean, who cares? I mean, I feel terrible for people in Ukraine, but me posting on social media has absolutely nothing to do with that. So I think and that's a small example, but there's this reactionary culture of feeling the need to put something out there, right? Versus having a much, to your point, level-headed orientation around how long time actually heals a lot of things, right? Brings down the highs and the lows and brings them back to the center. Everything's regresses to the mean.
And from a coaching perspective, how people grow, there's typically, a base of it's grace, truth, and time. Yeah. And what you just said time. Well, I want it done now. That's kind of not how God's made us.
Yeah.
It's, an entire life of growing and sanctification, and it takes time. So, yeah.
Well, to your point, like we've already talked about, part of diversity and equity and inclusion is having grace for people to work through things in their life, right? But it's also holding the line on a culture of truth and telling truth. And it's giving time, right? There's all three of those things we touched on today. So there you go. I'm not sure if you planned that, but that was really good. Way to summarize it.
Well, I think but what we're doing here, we're just having a conversation.
Yeah.
And keep having those conversations. We will do it, and I would encourage our business leaders, hey, talk to someone you disagree with, but try to figure out why is it that you think that way? Not to convince them, but try to figure out why it is that is how they think.
Yep. Yeah, no, and I think welcoming hard conversations is, again, another healthy way to have DE&I in a small way of just welcoming hard conversations and different perspectives. Just hear them out.
Absolutely.
There you go.
Well, good. Well, hey, that was fun. Hopefully we don't get you banned from too many future... No, you're level-headed. I've seen you talk to anyone and everyone, and you're like, that's a really good idea. Even if you... like I can pull that out of that, or you figure out how can we help this company work.
We do our best.
Well, good.
All right.
Hey, between us or between now and next week, hey, go on to the consultantandthecoach.com, reach out to us for a consultation, or just listen in next week and tell a buddy, hey, I've listened to the Consultant and the Coach.
There you go. I could always use more listeners. Reach out to us anytime.
Okay. You guys have a good day.
Take care.